Hey, welcome to Cokesbury Church. I'm Anna, one of the pastors here. I'm glad you're making time to join us today. You are getting this message either on podcast or on a screen, and that's because technology has changed over the years and we get these opportunities to connect in new ways. But information and the way we get it has changed a lot, even since you were a kid or since I was a kid. I'm considered what's called an elder millennial. So that means I'm not Generation X or Y or Z or whatever. I'm considered a millennial, but I'm an old millennial, as they say. So that means that I grew up with about half of my childhood without the internet and about half of my growing up years with the internet. So I got my first email address in the 8th grade. So that kind of gives you the reference point for sort of when that digital world sort of started entering my life. But even though in middle school and high school, I was starting to, instant message people online and have an email, it did not mean I grew up in any kind of digital society in the way that sort of we experience it today. In fact, if we wanted to see a movie in our hometown, there was no way to look that up if you didn't get the newspaper. So if you got the newspaper, you had it, or if you went and bought a newspaper, but the only other way to get it was you would call on just a landline phone, you would call the movie theater, and there would be a recording, and it would list every single movie. They might be showing 7 movies. They would list each movie one at a time and then say the showing times for that particular day. So you would call with a piece of paper and a pen, and you'd be trying to furiously scribble down the names of the movies and the times and all of that. And inevitably, somebody in your family would walk by and start talking too loud, and you would miss the one movie that you cared about knowing the times for. And then there wasn't even an option to repeat it. You had to hang up the phone and call them back and listen to that whole message over again. So that's just a snapshot of how much my life has changed to now. Where to get information now, if I wanted to go see a movie today, I would open an app on my phone and in 5 seconds could find out the movie times for today and every day for the next week. It's just a completely different thing. So though the technology has changed, the need for information has never changed. The urgency about sharing information has never changed. It's just the vehicle that has morphed and shifted over time. But what is universal for you, for me, throughout the generations of people that have lived is that when something is important, you tell someone. That has been the case since the first things that have been recorded about humans all the way to now, that when something is important, you tell someone. That is a basic thing within us as humans. That's never been different. Even as technology shifts and changes in the future to stuff that we can't even get our heads around right now, it's all based on this fact that when something's important, you tell somebody. It's a basic fact of our life. On April 18th, 1775, on the cusp of the Revolutionary War, Paul Revere alerted the people in the Boston, Massachusetts area that the British troops were moving that night as they had anticipated, and the troops were moving into place just before what would become the battles of Lexington and Concord that would start the Revolutionary War itself. Now, you probably learned about this through the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem about Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. This is where many people hear about this. And in that poem, it talks about the fact that the Old North Church in Boston, the tower of that church, would be the starting point of this signal. The famous phrase, 1 if by land and 2 if by sea. That meant that if the British were taking the land route, if they were going to be marching on land to their position, then they would hang 1 lantern in the tower. And if the British were taking the water route to get into position, there would be 2 lanterns in the tower. This was important information for the people who wanted to stand against the British troops, these revolutionary people who had these ideals and they wanted to protect their land and their people in a certain way. They needed to know, are the British coming by land or the British coming by sea? So that night, Paul Revere passed the message along that the British were moving via the Charles River, which meant that 2 lanterns hung in the Old North Church. That was how he got the information across to the people of that area of what was happening. And then he and a bunch of other people actually got on horseback and spread out around the countryside and started spreading this message about the British. They were risking their life because when something's important, you tell someone. Paul Revere and his friends and his colleagues thought, it doesn't matter if it ends their life serving in this way. They needed to get the message out of where the British were going to be and how they were getting there so that the people could be ready to defend themselves. Because when something's important, you tell someone. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, effectively outlawing slavery in the southern states. Now, we'll pause there to say the Emancipation Proclamation by no means solved the problem of slavery or racism or any of the other numbers of things that we are still dealing with today, but it was a piece of this puzzle, a step in the process. January 1st, 1863. And that's a pretty big thing to happen. And in our modern minds, we think about something of that magnitude happening now, and that everybody would just know, and everything would just sort of change immediately because we had this bit of information. However, the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation depended upon the advancement of Union troops into areas that still had this type of institutional slavery. Now, as you can imagine, people at that time in those states were not overly excited about this prospect. They were not doing this on their own. So Union troops were going into the states of the former Confederacy and enforcing this new proclamation. Now, Texas was the farthest Confederate state, and there weren't many Union troops there. So it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, a year and a half later, about 18 months after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, that an announcement by Union Army General Gordon Granger proclaimed freedom for slaves in Texas, which was the last state in the Confederacy with institutional slavery. A year and a half from Abraham Lincoln stroking his signature across that page until the last slaves in the former Confederacy were free. Now, that information was important, and it needed to get where it needed to go, but there was obstacles in the way. There were people that didn't want to share that information, people that didn't want that message to get out. So the holiday, Juneteenth, that many of you have heard about, that is celebrated in our country now, is celebrated on June 19th. And some people go, but that's not when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. That wasn't the end of slavery. But June 19th is the date that that information finally got to the last people that didn't have it yet. It commemorates the day that that news reached Texas and that the people who were enslaved in Texas were allowed to be free. There was opposition, there was difficulty. This news and information needed to get out, and it needed to change things. And the Union troops and the other people that were involved didn't stop, because when something's important, you tell somebody. When something's important, you don't stop when there's an obstacle. You don't stop if it takes a year or 2 years. You keep going, because when something's important, you tell somebody. On May 8th, 1945, the Allied forces celebrated VE Day, or Victory Over Europe Day. VE Day is the abbreviation for that. However, the official surrender of Germany had actually happened on May 6th, 2 days before, about a day and a half, because it was sort of in the middle of the night when that happened. On May 6th, in France, 17 reporters were invited by the US Army to witness the surrender, to witness the signing of the surrender documents that were happening in the early hours that night. Those reporters that came were told that the information was not to be shared for 36 hours. That even though this was happening in the early hours of May 6th, they were not supposed to say anything until later on in that week, because there was going to be a second celebration ceremony in Berlin. And that ceremony needed to take place before this information got out. However, one of the 17 reporters that was there that night was Edward Kennedy. He was an AP reporter for the Associated Press, the AP, and he was in the room when that happened, and it was this incredible moment, something that people around the world were holding their breath over, waiting for this to happen. And afterwards, he goes back to where he's staying in France, and he finds out that in Germany, this information is already being broadcast over the radio. There hadn't been the same agreement there, and people are finding out. So he takes it upon himself to get in touch with the Associated Press Bureau in London, and he shares the news about the surrender much before, hours before they're supposed to release this information. The AP in London then sends the word on to New York City, and Kennedy's story was the first one to break the news on the front page of the Times that they had declared victory in Europe, that the Nazis had surrendered, this incredible piece of news. He wasn't supposed to say anything, but when something is important, you tell somebody. Now, in his case, he got in a lot of trouble for breaking the agreement. When the army tells you to do something, they expect that you're going to do it. And he was later fired from his job, ostracized. People really criticized him until many years later when there was an apology made saying, you know what, you did an okay thing. We understand why you did that. But word continued to spread around the world. There were troops stationed all over the globe, and word is having to travel to these folks, letting them know the Allied forces have declared victory in Europe. The war is not over. They were still fighting in Japan in the Pacific arena, but part of this war had ended. Naval ships all across oceans all around the world were flying flags that indicated that the Allied forces had declared victory over Germany. Japan hadn't been defeated, but the Allied forces there notified Germany in their own way by shooting all different kinds of rounds of targets at Okinawa that day to say, we are still fighting, we are still committed, but we've had this huge victory. And they did all of those things because when something is important, you tell somebody. You stop at nothing to get the information that you need to get across. In July of 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. They get in the Apollo 11 spacecraft and the world is watching as they go into space, trying to be the first people, the first humans to land a mission on the moon, where humans are getting to walk on the moon. People had been into space before that, but the big race was who can put humans on the moon first. It's an incredible story of how this mission unfolded, all of the things that had to happen exactly right for them to get exactly where they needed to be, all with the technology of 1969, not 2021 like we know it now. One of the things that amazes me about that time was that as Neil Armstrong comes down the ladder out of the capsule and steps on to the moon for the first time, it was a live broadcast that many of you who were alive then and remember that know that live people watched Neil Armstrong step onto the moon and utter the famous words, one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. There was a lot of stuff to be done to get those guys to the moon, a lot more stuff done to get them home safely and alive, but they took the time to make sure there was documentation that people like us could see this incredible thing happen, because when something is important, you tell someone. When something's important, you make a way, you figure out a way to share this message. In Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 8, we read about a night that something else amazing happened. In that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid. For see, I'm bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign for you. You'll find a child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those whom he favors." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that's taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had happened and what had been told to them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds had told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, as it had been told to them. The shepherds had had this life-altering experience, this once-in-a-lifetime thing. They've heard the very first news of the birth of the Christ child, the news delivered to them by the angels, and they went and they saw for themselves, and then they told someone. They went out and they started telling everybody who will listen, you got to understand what happened, and it says in the scripture that everybody who heard it was amazed. The news about the birth of Jesus began to spread because they heard something important, they knew something important, and they told someone. In John chapter 20, starting in verse 1, we read, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to him, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him.' Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter came, followed him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings itself, but rolled up in a place on its own. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they didn't understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, just tell me where you've laid him. I will take him away." And then Jesus said to her, "Mary." He called her by name. She turned to him and in Hebrew said, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Don't hold on to me because I've not yet ascended to the Father, but go on to my brothers and say to them that I'm ascending to the Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said to her and what they were supposed to do. Mary Magdalene got to be the first person to see the risen Christ, and then the first person to share the message that Jesus had not been stolen from the tomb, that Jesus was alive. The message that the shepherds began, Mary Magdalene continued. Christ has come. Christ has redeemed us. Christ has risen, and the news spread. It spreads first among the disciples and the early followers of Jesus, and then among the early church, and then throughout the region, and then across the centuries until today. And here we are in the Christmas of 2021. And y'all, when something important happens, you tell somebody. Those of us who follow Jesus, we hold the most important message and information of all. And our calling, all of us, is to share that message of Jesus that Jesus has come to bring us hope and a new life, forgiveness and grace, a new beginning. And when you know something important, you gotta tell somebody. Boutros Tutu and his family came to Knoxville over 10 years ago as refugees from Sudan. The people of Cokesbury Church were one of the groups that helped to welcome the Tutu family into Knoxville. We've been blessed to kind of get to watch as their family has grown and thrived over the years. We're especially thankful when we got to watch Boutros accept a call to ministry and become a United Methodist pastor, and he started a Sudanese congregation in Maryville. So there's a group of refugees and other people from Sudan who get together and worship in their own language and get to worship and praise God, take next steps together, grow in their faith, and share the gospel. And he's been preaching and leading there for several years, and it's just been an incredible thing to watch the power of the Holy Spirit in that place. But since then, Boutros Tutu and his congregation have worked to translate the United Methodist Book of Worship into Arabic. There are Arabic Bibles, but the United Methodist Church has this Book of Worship, and it has services for baptism and communion. It's got prayers and scriptures, all kinds of things to help us in our times of worship together. And Boutros and his wife Muna and their congregation have translated this Book of Worship for the first time into Arabic. And now he and his wife Muna are planning to visit Sudan, to go back to the country from which they came, to personally deliver these books of worship to churches and faith communities around the area in Sudan that they're going to visit. Because Boutros knows something important. And he knows about Jesus, and he is making sure that he tells someone. He's making sure that he tells them in person, in their own language, that he goes to all the lengths that he's gone to translate these important words for people who need to hear about the story of Jesus. He knows something important, and he's gonna tell someone. But what about us? It's easy to think that the shepherds or Mary Magdalene or the disciples or even Reverend Tutu are somehow different than us. They're more special, or they're more called, or they're set apart in some way that we're not. But actually, what unites all those people and what unites you and me and all of us is that we're just children of God. We're simply children of God whose lives have been changed by Jesus. We're people who have heard the message of Jesus. We're people who have experienced the love of Jesus. We're people who've said yes to Jesus. These are people who've said yes to Jesus and their lives have been changed, and then they've told someone. Our calling this Christmas is as simple as the calling of the shepherds. It's that once you meet Jesus, you just tell someone. when I really began to accept my faith for my own, when it really began to make sense to me and I started to take ownership of my own faith, was right about early high school. And I was a teenager and I really started to feel passionate about becoming a follower of Jesus and understanding how that would all work. And in that process, I started to have this urgency about sharing my faith. I was hearing stuff like this, like you need to share your faith and you tell people about Jesus. I was like, okay. In my young teenage mind, I had ideas about what that might be like. And I started to try to think about where are there times in my life that I could do this, that I could share my faith. And there was this guy who was younger than me. He was in a grade younger than me in high school. And we were in a class together, the last class of the day. And we sort of started a friendship. He was totally different than me. I hadn't known him before this class. And we started talking and had become friends. And there had been times when religious or spiritual stuff had come up before. So I felt like the door was kind of open there. So I decided to take it upon myself that I'm going to share Jesus with this guy. I'm going to talk to him about this. I'm going to share the gospel. So one day I sort of felt like it was the right time. And this was the line I used. I said, so what do you think about Jesus? Which very smooth, very compelling. I know you're, really impressed. You probably wrote that down. It's a really good opening line there. And he replied, so my question is, so what do you think about Jesus? He replied, I think Jesus is the stuff. Now, he did not use the word stuff. He used a word that I'm not going to use right now in case your kids are listening to this podcast with you. He said a different word. And so it was like enthusiastic, like he feels good about Jesus, but totally threw me off. I was not expecting that response. It kind of shut me down into the conversation. That was pretty much the end of it. Now, from that first failed evangelistic effort, I learned that sort of trying to force a conversation about Jesus and just drop it out of nowhere, that is not the way to go. I was not being natural or authentic to who I was. I felt like I needed to check this box of sharing my faith in some certain way. And what I learned in that moment is that instead of trying to share Jesus that way, the way to do it was just to be authentically myself. That as a friendship unfolds, as a relationship unfolds, that I just authentically share anytime I get a chance about my experience with Jesus, about what God has done for me. It also means that some of the most important ways I share that are not even with my words. It's in reflecting the way that Jesus loves me by loving other people that same way. It means trying my best to share God's love with people around me. It means that when I mess up, I apologize and I try again and I try to do better. It means that I share the story of how God saved my life, of how God is still saving my life at this very moment today. I share honestly and openly anytime I get the chance because that is what is important. To share our faith, to share this message, doesn't mean that we have to go out and stand on a street corner and yell at people. It means that we let people know in our own way that they are not alone, that they are loved, that they are welcomed, that they can be forgiven, that they can start again. And there's nothing more important than that message. If you've had that encounter with Jesus, if you have that relationship with Jesus, it's important. And you got to tell someone. I want you to be thinking throughout this week about a couple of things. First, I want you to think about what you need to tell. And then I want you to think about who you need to tell. So first, the question is just, what has God done in your life? It's a simple question. I think sometimes we make sharing our faith pretty complicated. But the question is just, what has God done in your life? If you want to write it down, I find that that's a really helpful way to think about this, to write down your story. Your testimony is simply the story of what God has done. It's just the story of how you met Jesus, how you got to know him, what has changed in you, what's not changed yet in you, that you are still working on and praying on and following on. Just what has God done? Just the simple story of what God has meant to you, of how Jesus has changed your life. And then we start to ask ourselves, who needs to hear that? What are the situations? Who are the people who would benefit from your story? Maybe it's your kids. Maybe they don't know the full story of how God's worked in your life, and you can begin to tell that story to them. Maybe it is a friend or a coworker or somebody on your team or somebody in your class who's going through a tough time, and you're thinking, yeah, I actually kind of know a lot about what they're going through because I've been through something similar. Maybe God is inviting you to tell your story to that person because you're in a specific place. You're in a specific set of circumstances that is uniquely designed for you to have a plan and a purpose in that life. For you to be a messenger of the gospel. For you to be like the shepherds and like Mary Magdalene, sharing the message. So I want to ask you this Christmas, Will you give somebody the gift of sharing the news of what God's done? Will you tell somebody the story of what happened at Christmas, of what happened at the empty tomb, and then what it means for you? Not as an abstract story, but what does it actually mean in your own life? Would you this Christmas give somebody the gift of just honestly sharing your story? A couple, 2-3 years ago, we met a man here at Cokesbury who was going through a really tough time. And he was living in his car, and he just had a lot of things stacked against him. And we got to know him over time, and our staff and some of you became friends with him. He began to volunteer here. He helped serve coffee and just became a part of our church family. And it was amazing to get to know him and get to hear his story. But he just posted something on Facebook just a couple of weeks ago, and he gave his permission for us to share this. And I wanted to read you his words. He says, "I have a story. I was almost dead. I didn't die. I lost my faith, and now I found God. I was a drug addict, and now I'm clean. I hated myself, and now I feel worthy. I was homeless and living on the streets, and now I have a roof over my head. I would struggle to find something to eat, and now I have food on my table. I almost lost my family, and now they're there for me. I used to hurt people, and now I work for my money. I wanted to die so many times, and now I want to live. I forgot about my dreams, and now I see a future. I was lost, and now I'm found. I can do it, and so can you. I used to hang my head down, and now I hold it high. I was selfish and only thought of me, and now I'm here for those in need. Hi, my name is Greg, and I'm a survivor, and so are you." Greg knew something important. He knows something important. And he told somebody. In his case, it was a little paragraph on his Facebook page, as a way to shine a light out into the darkness, to say, if you're going through something similar, I've been there, and here's what God's done for me. You know something important too. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you know something important, and I want to challenge you and invite you to find a way to tell someone. And if you aren't a follower of Jesus, what I'm saying today is the most important thing that we could ever talk about together. It's the fact that you are loved and welcomed by God this Christmas and every day before and after. So this Christmas, that's our calling as Cokesbury Church. That's our calling as a people of faith, as Christians, is to step out and just tell somebody. Let's pray. God, we think about these amazing moments in history, these times where great things happened and people were a part of sharing that news. And sometimes it seems like they're somehow different than us, like they're special or they're better than us, but really they were just regular people who said yes to you. So God, today we want to say yes to you. We come to you humbly saying, thank you for asking us to be a part of sharing this Christmas message. God, give us the strength and the courage and the wisdom and the discernment to know when and how and who. Give us the power of the Holy Spirit working through us so that this Christmas we could tell somebody. So in your son's name we pray, amen.